Okay, well, they're in the hut. Charlie shows up, checks everybody out, and he leaves. The next morning, he comes back and with a group of Chinese guerrillas. He organizes them, gets them to make some stretchers, rudimentary stretchers out of bamboo poles and little platforms that they latched or they roped together. And they took off, I guess it was probably around 9 o'clock or so, and they were carrying the 4 injured men on the stretchers. Dad's walking behind. They went a little further inland, and they stopped at another larger building where the Chinese guerrillas were kind of getting more organized, and they stopped for a while. The guerrillas kind of figured out what their plans were, and then shortly after that they took off again and started moving across the island. They went for a couple more hours, and then they reached a canal where the injured crewmen and Dad were loaded onto a small boat that was pulled through the canal to the other side of the island. And then when they reached the end of that, they got out and started moving again toward the edge of the island. In the meantime, as they were overlooking a bay down below, they saw a Japanese search vessel moving up toward the bay in a slow motion, because they were obviously looking for the crew. The coolies saw that, and they just suddenly dropped the guys that were on the stretchers, eliciting a lot of groans and pain and stuff from the injured guys. And then when the boat cleared the area, went further out and went elsewhere, they picked them back up, and they carried them out to a dock where they were loaded onto a Chinese junk, a larger boat, which carried them across the area of the ocean between the island and the mainland. And that took them about a night and a day or so to get over there. Once they got over there, they were another set of coolies with stretchers picked them up, and they started moving inland. And they went as far as a city called Haiyu, and they were met there by a Chinese doctor. His name was Dr. Chen, and his father, who was also a doctor and a nurse. And they gave him some rudimentary first aid. They didn't have a lot of supplies. And then Chen told them that he wanted them to be carried to the Enza clinic in the township of Linhai. So they subsequently gathered up the group again, and they started what was a pretty arduous 3-day trek through some pretty high mountain areas, and it was a pretty rough trail. But anyway, they finally made it after 3 days to the Enza clinic, and Dad was really pleased to get there because there were some British missionaries at the clinic, and so they were better able to communicate with the Chinese. And anyway, they were put into the Enza clinic. They started receiving some additional first aid and were beginning to recuperate to a certain extent. But Lawson's leg had become infected with gangrene by this time, and so they knew they would need, that especially he would need additional help and aid. In the meantime, the crew became aware that another raider crew, crew number 15, had landed out on the water further away from the island. They'd had a safe landing on the water, and they were able to get out of the plane. They had their life raft, and by another amazing coincidence, crew number 15 had the flight surgeon as their engineer gunner. His name was Doc White. So Crew 15 found out, actually through Charlie, he encountered Crew 15, and Davenport had actually given Charlie his passport. So when Charlie encountered Crew 15, he showed them the passport, told them where Crew number 7 had gone, and so Crew number 15 took the route and basically followed the route that Crew number 7 had taken, and ended up at Enza Clinic a few days later. By this time, Lawson's leg was just getting worse and worse, and so when Doc White got there, he conferred with Dr. Chen and his father, and they gave Lawson some treatment. You know, I think they might have had some morphine and stuff like that, but they didn't really have a lot of antibiotics or anything like that to deal with. So there was no way that they were going to be able to save Lawson's leg. And Doc White broke the news gently to Lawson. Lawson obviously did not want to lose his leg, but it was, you know, given the circumstances, there was nothing that could be done. So Doc White, Dr. Chen, and his father, the elder Dr. Chen, subsequently operated on Lawson in an operating room at the Enza Clinic, and they amputated his left leg above the knee. The operation was successful. Lawson was pretty weak for a while, but a couple of days after that, Crew number 15 minus Doc White, who was going to stay behind and keep an eye on the other crew members and Lawson, took off with my dad, because my dad was obviously in good shape and he could travel. They took off inland toward to where Free China was. So ultimately they wanted to get to Chongqing, where they could take off and get back to the U.S. So for the next several days, Dad and the members of Crew 15 were ferried through the inland of China by, they were carried in sedan chairs, they rode by automobiles, they went on small boats, made river crossings, and then they went as far as Chuzhou, which is where there's an air raid shelter that's carved into the side of a mountain. And they stopped there for a few days, and the Japanese were having daily bombing raids over Chuzhou. And so when those would occur, the raiders that were gathered there, as many as, I believe, between 30 and 50, would all go inside this bomb raid shelter that was carved into the side of this mountain, and there were cots set up, and they would just stay in there until it was safe to get out, and then they would go back out, and then when the next bombing raid came, they would go back in. But they were there for several days. And then after that, they started moving even further inland, and they made it to Chongqing, and they stayed there for a while. And a few days after they got there, there were probably about 20 raiders there. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, showed up and did kind of a reception welcome for the raiders, and they pinned little Chinese medals on each of the raiders that were there, and they were thanked profusely for their efforts. And of course, Chiang Kai-shek couldn't speak English, but his wife had been educated in the United States, and so she spoke fluent English. And she walked up to my dad, and he during the interim time between when the raid had started, and then their plane had crash landed, and then they'd gone inland to China. Dad had gotten pretty scruffy. His hair had gotten kind of, out of sorts. He was he's growing a little bit of a beard. So he got a shave and a haircut, but they used like hand clippers to clip off his hair. And Madam Chiang walked up to Dad and she said, I see you've given some of your hair for the war effort. So anyway, they stayed there for a while longer, and finally they were cleared to fly out from Chongqing. They took off, and then they took a circuitous route. They flew first over the Himalayas, over the hump, to India, and then they stopped in Calcutta and were waiting their orders there. So Dad was there for, I guess, about 10 days. And then from there, they flew to Cairo, Egypt, and across the Mideast, and then ultimately flew across the Atlantic to Brazil. They were on a Pan American clipper, and then they flew gradually up from Brazil and finally ended up in Miami, where Dad embarked on, or got off the plane onto the soil of the United States. And the first thing he had was a hamburger and a milkshake. And they stayed there for a few days, and then they flew up to Washington, D.C., and this was in June, early June. And there was an award ceremony for the raiders that were there. I believe there was between 20 and 25. And that's when they were presented, the raiders that were there, the Distinguished Flying Cross. And my dad was the lowest ranking member of the raid at that award ceremony to receive the medal.